The morning started off like any other. Mom had planned a trip to visit Grandma, a 3-hour drive, leaving Dad and me home alone for the weekend. She packed an overnight bag, kissed us goodbye, and left us with a refrigerator full of leftovers and a long list of chores. Dad seemed upbeat, humming a tune as he brewed his coffee. From across the kitchen island, I watched him, noticing how at ease he seemed without Mom's usual bustling energy filling the house. It wasn't that they didn't get along, but there was always a subtle tension between them, quiet, yet undeniable. "Got any plans for today?" he asked, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Not really," I replied. "Just some homework. You?" He shrugged. "Figured I'd tackle the garage. It's a mess in there." I nodded, though the idea didn't excite me. The garage was a chaotic black hole of forgotten projects and clutter. "Could use a hand," he added with a grin. I groaned but agreed. Dad rarely asked for help, and I figured a few hours of organizing might make the time pass faster. By mid-morning, we were knee-deep in boxes and scattered tools. The summer heat turned the garage into an oven, and Dad had stripped down to a tank top, his usual button-up tossed over a chair. "This stuff hasn't been touched in ages," I remarked, pulling out a box of old photo albums. "Yeah," Dad said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Your mom's always saying we should go through it, but life gets busy." He leaned against the workbench, flipping through an album. His expression softened when he came across a picture of him and Mom from years ago. They looked so young, so carefree. "Things were different back then," he murmured, almost to himself. I didn't push him to elaborate and instead focused on another box of random knickknacks and tools. As the hours passed, the garage slowly transformed from a chaotic mess to something more orderly. Dad's mood seemed to lighten, and we even laughed over some of the odd items we found buried in the clutter. Toward the end, Dad opened a box labeled Memories. Inside were letters, ticket stubs, and little keepsakes from the past. He pulled out a bracelet, holding it up to the light. "Your mom made this for me when we were dating," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. I smiled, but there was a wistfulness in his tone that didn't quite match the moment. By the time we finished, the garage was tidy, a small victory. We celebrated with cold drinks on the porch as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the yard. Dad sat quietly, his gaze fixed on some far-off point. "You okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. He nodded but didn't meet my eyes. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" He exhaled, drumming his fingers on the armrest. "Life, I guess. How fast it moves. How easy it is to get stuck." The last word hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I didn't know how to respond, so I sipped my drink, waiting for him to continue. "When I was your age," he said after a pause, "I had so many dreams. Places I wanted to go. Things I wanted to do." He smiled faintly. "And then life happened. Marriage, kids, responsibilities. Not that I regret it, but sometimes you wonder what could have been," I finished for him. He glanced at me, surprised. "Yeah, exactly." I understood more than he realized. Even at my age, I already felt the weight of expectations pressing down. College, a career, family. It all felt pre-planned, like there was no room for detours. "I think everyone feels that way at some point," I said. "It doesn't mean you're unhappy." "True," he agreed, nodding slowly. "But it's easy to lose parts of yourself along the way." The conversation felt heavier than usual, but it also seemed important, like he was showing me a side of himself I hadn't seen before. After a while, he stretched and stood. "Let's order dinner, my treat." We ended up eating pizza in the living room with an old sitcom playing in the background. Neither of us paid much attention to the TV, but it was nice, just the two of us. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Later that night, as I was heading to my room, Dad called out from the living room. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I turned back, curious. "Sure." He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Do you think I've been a good father?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I said immediately. "Why would you even ask that?" He shrugged, looking down at his hands. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I could have done more. Been more." "Dad," I said firmly, stepping closer. "You've done plenty. You're here. You care. And that means everything." He met my gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw tears glistening in his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, kiddo," he said softly. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel that today had uncovered more than just old boxes. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Dad's words played over and over in my mind. It wasn't like him to be so introspective, so vulnerable. I wondered what had brought it on. Was it just the nostalgia of sorting through the boxes? Or was there something deeper he wasn't sharing? The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of the refrigerator. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of our conversation pressing down on me. Around midnight, I decided to get a glass of water. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed a faint glow from the living room light spilling into the corridor. Curious, I peeked around the corner and saw Dad still awake, sitting on the couch with a drink in his hand. His head was tilted back, eyes closed, though it didn't look like he was asleep. "Can't sleep either?" I asked, stepping into the room. His eyes opened and he gave me a tired smile. "Guess not." I settled on the other end of the couch, pulling a throw blanket over my legs. What's on your mind?" I asked. He swirled the ice in his glass, taking a slow sip before answering. "Your mom and I had an argument before she left. Nothing major, just one of those fights that sticks with you." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "She says I'm distant," he admitted, "that I don't talk to her enough. But the truth is, sometimes I don't know what to say." "Why not?" I asked, tilting my head. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of making it worse." It was strange seeing Dad like this, so unsure, so vulnerable. He had always been the strong one, the steady presence in our family. "Maybe she just wants to know what you're thinking," I suggested softly. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "And what if what I'm thinking isn't what she wants to hear?" For a moment, the room felt heavy with things left unsaid. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I could feel the weight of it. "Sometimes," he continued, "I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Like the person I've become isn't who I was meant to be." His words hit harder than I expected. I'd had those thoughts too, though I never imagined Dad would. "Maybe it's not about being who you were supposed to be," I said carefully, "but about finding a way to be happy with who you are now." He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "You're wise beyond your years, you know that?" he said, a faint smile on his face. I smiled back, though it felt bittersweet. "I learned from the best." Dad chuckled softly, but the sadness in his eyes remained. We sat there in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, filled with a mutual understanding. Eventually, I stood to head back to bed, placing a hand on his shoulder as I passed. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, kiddo," he replied softly. As I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night would stay with me. The next morning, the house was still quiet. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm golden light over the living room. I found Dad in the kitchen, already up and nursing a cup of coffee. His expression was calm, but hinted at something deeper. "Morning," I said, grabbing a mug for myself. "Morning," he replied. "Sleep better?" I nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. The weight of our conversation lingered, but I didn't want to push him about it. We spent the day moving through small tasks in a quiet, unspoken rhythm. It felt peaceful, though the air between us seemed delicate, as if stretched thin. That afternoon, Dad suggested we go for a drive. "Clear our heads," he said. Curious, I agreed. We ended up at the park he used to take me to when I was little. It looked almost the same. The weathered benches and towering oak trees hadn't changed. We walked along the path in silence until we reached the small pond at the center. "I used to bring you here all the time," he said, his voice laced with nostalgia. "You'd run straight to the ducks every time." I smiled at the memory. I remember. He sat on a bench and I joined him. The sound of rustling leaves filled the quiet air. "I've been thinking about what we talked about last night," he began, his eyes fixed on the water. I didn't say anything, letting him find the right words. "You were right," he admitted. "It's not about what could have been. It's about learning to be happy with what is." I glanced at him, surprised by the change in his tone. "I've spent so much time looking back," he continued, "dwelling on what I think I missed out on. But the truth is, I have so much to be grateful for. Your mom, you, our life together. I need to remember that more often." His honesty caught me off guard, but it also brought a quiet sense of relief. "I think everyone feels lost sometimes," I said gently. "But it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong." He nodded, a faint smile forming on his lips. "Thanks, kiddo, for listening, for understanding." We sat there for a while, watching the ducks glide across the pond. The moment felt important, like a turning point for both of us. By the time we returned home, the tension of the past few days had eased. Dad seemed lighter, more present, and I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. When Mom came back later that evening, the house filled with her usual warmth and energy. Dad greeted her with a smile and pulled her into a hug that lasted just a bit longer than usual. As I watched them, I realized that even the strongest relationships have their cracks, but it's the effort to repair them that truly matters.